Hey everyone, and welcome to the S79 sewing tutorials. So today's project is how to make a draft excluder, and this is a great project because it's the same pattern to make a bolster cushion. So you can either make a long draft excluder and it can be made to the size that you wish, or make it smaller and a bit wider and you have yourself a bolster cushion. So it's the same principle for both. Okay, so we need to decide on the length of your draft excluder and also the girth of your draft excluder. So for the length, measure the area that you wish to cover. I've measured the door that I want to cover and just a little bit more, and mine is coming out at 36 inches. For the girth of your draft excluder, a quick way of doing it is just to form your tape measure into like a circle on the end, just a rough circle, which will give you sort of an idea of sort of an end-on view of how thick it will be. I'm going to go for 16 inches, which is quite a nice amount for a draft excluder. So based on 36 inches long by 16 inches around, that's the size piece that we need to cut. Now we do need to allow an extra inch for seam allowances. That allows for ½ an inch seam allowance on either side. So take your measurements, add an inch onto both of the measurements, and that will be the piece that you need to cut. Mine was 36 in length, so I'm going to measure 37 inches. And I'm actually using a piece of old curtain here, so it fits nicely. So I'm just putting a mark at 37 inches and 37 inches, and then measure your width. So I wanted my girth to be 16 inches, so I'm actually measuring 17 inches to allow a seam on both sides. So it just so happens that my fabric is 17 inches wide, so I don't need to cut that already. I'm just checking all the way along, and that's fine. So cut your once you've measured, you've got your sizes, cut your fabric piece out. You just need one of these. Okay, so we have the fabric folded and pressed for the main body of the draft excluder. I'm going to put some circles on the ends of my draft excluder. I just think it will look nicer than just doing a straight edge. You can just do a straight edge, obviously, if you wish to. But to do the circles, I don't currently have a compass or any equipment in my home studio, so I'm going to show you a quick cheap way to do it. So the circumference of the ends of my draft excluder is 17 inches. So I'm just quite simply I'll just turn this to show you. So make a circle with your tape measure. I'm actually going to put a clip on it so it stays at 17, and I'm just forming it into a nice circular shape with my tape measure, and then I'm going to just draw carefully around the circle. Go on the inside or the outside of your circle template. You can, of course, if you wish to, take the circumference and divide it by 3.1415, which is pi, and that will give you the diameter, so you can draw an accurate circle. This is quite a nice cheats way to do it though. You don't need a compass and you don't need circle templates. There we are. So I've just sketched out, it's not the greatest circle, but I've just sketched out a rough circle. It won't make a difference to the finished look of it. So that's fine. So I'm going to flip this in half. You need 2 of these, and I'm just going to cut out the circles. So just cutting them out. Okay then, so now you should have your rectangular piece, which is the actual main body of the draft excluder, and 2 end piece circles. So this is the same method if you want to make a bolster cushion as well. Okay, so taking the rectangular piece, you need to fold it in half lengthways, lining up the raw edges with right sides together. So the right sides are next to each other and you have the wrong side on the outside. Line up the raw edges all the way down, and we're going to stitch this closed. Now the key thing here is that we need to leave a small gap in which to turn the whole thing the right way round, and it's better done on the straight than trying to do it on the circles. So I'm just going to take a couple of pins and I'm going to put 2 pins in together just to remind me to stop. And it doesn't matter really where on this line you leave the gap. I'm sort of just putting it sort of central, and I want to leave probably about a 6-inch gap just to make turning easier. You don't want to leave it too big because you have to hand stitch this closed, but you don't want it too small that you're struggling to turn the whole thing the right way out. So starting this end, do a forwards backwards stitch all the way down to the double pins, do a forwards backwards to stop, forwards backwards here all the way down to the end, and a forwards backwards to finish. We're not doing anything with the 2 end pieces. So you want to stitch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, which is the extra inch that we added on is 1/2 inch on either side. So lining it up with the marking on the plate, you can start stitching. So when you get down to the double pins, remove the pins and do a couple of stitches forwards and backwards to lock that seam. There we are. So I've stitched all the way down here and I've stopped here. So my next starting point is at the double pins, leaving this gap empty and stitching all the way down to the end. And there we are. So that's all stitched now, and we have this long tube shape with a hole in the middle for us to be able to turn it the right way around. So at this point, if you wish to press your seam allowance out, then now is the time to do it. Try not to press this out. We don't want any sort of creases in the actual finish. But if you want to take it to the ironing board and just press those seams out, if you've got a thick fabric, it helps, and it will certainly help when you come to close up this area here. Okay, so I've pressed out my seam allowance now, and I've also pressed out the area where there's the gap. It'll just make it easier when we come to stitch that closed, that the seam allowance is always already folded back. So next we need to put the end pieces on. So take a circle and you're going to need to fold it in half, and then we're just going to clip the very corner off, just so that we have a mark, like a little notch cut out there. So we're going to do that on both ends. And then we're going to do the same thing by folding it this way. So remember, we didn't actually do a proper circle, but it gives you a chance to see that it's not so bad after all. So just clip a little notch there and a little notch there. That's it. So we have 4 points marked equally around the circle. So a 12 o'clock, a 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock and a 9 o'clock. And you're going to need to do that on both circles. It's important when you cut these notches that you don't cut them too deep. Otherwise, when you stitch round, you'll have a hole. So make sure that your notches are no deeper than about half a centimetre. They're only there for you to see when you're lining up. Cut these out. Okay, so we've got the notches marked on these circles, and now we just need to mark the points that will correspond with these points on here. So to do that, fold it in half so that you've got your seam allowance on one side. On the opposite side to the seam allowance, you're going to cut a notch, just like that. So you have a notch on the opposite side to the seam allowance. So you have 2 halfway points there, which would relate to the 2 halfway points on here. So to mark the other 2 points, we're going to take this and fold it so that you have the seam allowance and the notch you've just marked are on top of each other, and that gives us these 2 halfway points here. So again, cut a notch and follow it across and cut a notch in there. So there you can see we have a notch here, a notch here, a notch here, and the seam allowance isn't notched, but that's another point. And that will relate to the 4 notches that you've just put into the circle, so it'll help us to line it all up. So you're going to take a circle and make sure that you have the right side facing inwards. So your two right sides are together, and you're going to take one notch, whichever notch you like, and you're going to line the notch up on the circle to the seam allowance on your draft excluder and pop a pin in there. Next, follow it round and line up the next two notches, so the notch on your circle with the notch on the draft excluder, and we're going to pop a pin in there and follow it round and do exactly the same thing with the other two notches. So line up the notches and put a pin in. Line up the notches and put a pin in. So now on the one end of the draft excluder you should have the circle end piece pinned in place at the 4 notch points that we marked out, so 4 equal points. And now we're going to stitch around this area here, so the pins will help everything stay nice and even. So we're going to start stitching now. So I'm starting off with the seam allowance section. I'm popping it under my presser foot, and remember to allow a 1/2 inch seam allowance on this. So just ease it all the way around, go slowly, and just make sure that those raw edges of both the circle and the main body are all lined up. And just make sure as you go around that there aren't any tucks or folds. And there we are, so that's all stitched on now, and there aren't any tucks or creases, and it's gone on really nicely. So you need to repeat the same thing for the other side. If you had problems trying to get the circle to stitch onto obviously a straighter edge, one thing you can do to make life a little bit easier is take the main body of your draft excluder and just cut some small notches. Now the notches need to really be no deeper than half a centimetre. They're just to allow, as you start stitching it to the circle, to allow that to open out so that it can help to fit around the circle a little bit easier if you struggled with trying to get that to match on. Okay, so once again, as we did before, we're going to mark out the notches on the main body. So snipping out those notches, and again here, and then we're going to pin each of these notches to the notches we've made. And as you can see, the notches that we've cut are just helping this to open out so it forms that nice circular curve. So if you did struggle with one of them without doing the notches, then cut the notches and it will make life a lot easier. And again, stitch it in place. If you feel you're getting a tuck, the best way to deal with it is to before you stitch over it, lower the needle down into the fabric, lift the presser foot up, and just check and smooth everything out before putting your presser foot back down and continuing to sew. Okay, so that's all stitched in place. We have both ends of the draft excluder stitched in place like that. Now when we turn the whole thing back the right way out, all of this seam allowance is going to crumple up and we're not going to get a nice edge. So one of the things we need to do now when sewing curves is just to clip some notches in there. So being careful not to cut your stitch line, just cut some bigger notches in there all the way around, and it will just help that seam allowance to lay flat. So you're looking for big notches now, which come almost as far down as your stitches, but not quite. And do that all the way around both circles. Messy sewing again, there's bits flying everywhere. I'm going to need to get the vacuum again. There we are. So that's all notched there, and do the other side. Okay, so everything's notched and we're ready to turn the project the right way out. So go in through the opening that you made earlier, reach down, grab hold of the end and pull it out. And then do the same with the other side. Dive in, grab hold and pull out. And there you have your draft excluder. Just needs to be stuffed. So before you stuff it, put your hand down and just push out those edges. And now, because we cut those notches, there's not so much seam allowance and bulk in there, so this will lay nice and flat when we come to fill it. And we don't need to worry about pressing out this edge because it's going to be filled. And the same with this one. So a great thing for filling these draft excluders is use up your old pillows. So if you have any old pillows that have lost their fluff, just use those to stuff your draft excluder. You want to fill it quite tight. So through the opening, we're going to stuff some filler in and push it all the way down to the end. And as we fill it out, you can start seeing that take its shape. Okay, so once you have your draft excluder nicely stuffed, you just have this opening here which we need to close up. So what we're going to do is do like a ladder stitch to close that up, and we're going to do that by hand. Okay, so once you've attached your thread, the way to close up is just a simple ladder stitch, which if you're not sure what that is, I'll try and show you here. So we're going to go in one side, and obviously the seam allowance is already folded back because we pressed it open a while ago. So we have this nice smooth edge and this smooth edge, and we're going to join the two together with stitches going up and down. So start off here, and then as you bring your thread down, that's where your needle's going to go in and come out. And then lift your thread up, straight up, and that's where your needle's going to go in. So you're creating a ladder effect all the way along. Do that all the way along, and then when you pull it tight, it closes up that hole. So keep your stitches fairly close together and just keep pushing that stuffing back out the way. Okay, so there you can see the ladder stitch going all the way along. And if you take the end, I've taken it right back to a little bit further down. And then as you slowly pull, help stitches out by compressing it so that your thread doesn't break. So just taking the tension out of it. And as you can see, it's closing up. It's important to push this filler out the way as you close it. There we are. So just pushing this out the way and pulling on this end of thread, and it's just closing up that ladder stitch. If you've got any popping through, just push it back out the way as you close that up. And there we have it, all closed completely. So just knot off the end of your thread so it doesn't come undone, going twice through the loop, and then take your needle back into your project, pull it out, and the ends will be hidden away inside, and then you can cut that off. And there you are, all finished and ready to keep you nice and warm and stop the drafts getting in. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you managed to make one of these and keep yourself nice and warm, especially if the beast from the east comes. Thanks for watching. See you soon.